Assalamu alaikum, good evening, how's it? I am Zaid Ismail, author, life coach, mental health nut. I think we need to have a serious change in direction of the narrative that we have about mental health and these tough discussions. One of the many initiatives from my side to try and influence that change in direction. So tonight's discussion is going to be about narcissists, or at least more accurately, narcissistic behavior. And there's a good reason why I'm differentiating between the two, and hopefully that will become evident as we go through the discussion. Now, it's a big topic. So up front, I want to caution you that there are trigger warnings for this. I want to caution you that it's going to challenge assumptions that you make about the subject. And I want to also caution you that our effort, as always, is to seek to understand, not to defend, not to condone, not to justify, but to understand. And in trying to understand it, we then create an opportunity for ourselves to be able to deal with it more effectively. To get started, my usual challenge to you is to keep me honest. And to keep me honest, you need to make sure that I don't overcomplicate things. And if I do overcomplicate things, you need to ask me to correct myself, all right? Or to explain myself at least. Welcome, Zakia, Sofa, House. Long time no see. All right, so as our friend Einstein said, if you can't explain it simply, then you don't understand it well enough. So I'm hoping that I will do justice to this topic, because this topic is a huge topic, not just because of complexity, but because of the impact that it has on very real people's lives. And that impact, I want us to consider from both sides, not just one side, because more often than not, we have a villain and we have a victim. And yes, every situation where there is an imbalance of power, that is true. But you cannot unseat the villain if you don't understand what makes them tick. So tonight, hopefully, we're going to learn what makes them tick so that we can deal with the underlying influences that drives them to behave the way they do, rather than dealing with the symptoms and responding to the games that they may appear to play. So ground rules for growth to start off with very quickly. Like I said, we're going to seek to understand, not to justify. We must focus on the points being raised, and this is going to hit home for a lot of you. But if it hits home, try to separate from the person and the experience and focus on the point being raised, so that you might be able to get a healthier perspective of your experience with whoever it was that displayed these tendencies or these behaviors, so that you can empower yourself to be able to respond differently. All right, so focus on the point, not on the person. Own your space, and in owning your space, you own your response, you own your perspective, you own the assumptions that you make. And any assumptions you make are informed by your experiences. You need to be able to test how much of your experience is based on perspective, assumption, versus new information that you might come across. And hopefully, I hope tonight, there'll be some fresh insights for you to be able to work with. Analyzing doesn't imply insensitivity. So if we analyze either the villain or the victim, we're not trying to be insensitive towards the emotional impact of all of this. Just not tonight, not any night. The reason why we have to analyze is because if we understand what drives the behavior, it makes it possible for us to deal with the underlying influence, or to counter the underlying influence, rather than trying to challenge the symptom. All right, and that can be extremely liberating and empowering. So let's try and get that in as much as possible. And of course, we don't judge, because the moment we judge, we have a predetermined outcome that we're looking for. It's an external standard, and we're expecting compliance rather than focusing on understanding. So we seek to understand, because understanding allows us to appreciate why people behave the way they do, as opposed to looking at people and judging them for behaving a certain way. Because if you understand why they're behaving the way they do, it becomes possible for us to potentially influence them to behave differently. But you can't influence them differently if you don't understand where they're getting the influence from in the first place. there is a massive amount of debate about what drives us, what defines our behavior, and all of that. And I want to make it clear up front what my position is so that we understand the context within which I'm presenting my views and any opinions that I'm going to share with you. The human experience, and this is a contentious point, but the human experience is not a mental illness and it's not a mental disorder. The human experience is how we experience emotionally the events of our lives and how that shapes our behavior. And the moment we try to label that experience, we need to recognize one very important point. And that very important point that we need to recognize is that the moment we label someone's behavior, we are labeling our experience of their behavior, what we perceive their behavior to be or represent. And we're not in any way, through that label, defining what the intention or the underlying drivers are that causes them to behave that way. So if you see someone behaving badly and you label that behavior a certain way, that's because that bad behavior appears to you to be a certain way. And for tonight, we're saying that someone that behaves in the manners that we're going to discuss, that person is demonstrating narcissistic tendencies or behaviors. The person themselves might be understood or seen or judged as being a narcissist, but the moment you put a label on something, you focus on the label and you don't focus on the person. And when that happens, you lose the power of influence because you're now trying to operate within the parameters that the label defines. The other important thing, and this is not just for narcissists, this is across the board, if you label yourself or if you accept a label for yourself, so if someone says you are shy or someone says you are inappropriate or whatever it is, if you accept that label for yourself, subconsciously you are going to look for reason to respond within the confines of that label because you start defining your self-image against the parameters within which that label is understood and experienced. So labeling of behavior is a very, very sensitive thing because the moment you label the behavior, you lose sight of the real issues. So you can use the label to describe what it is that you're experiencing, but don't use it as a final judgment on what it is that is happening, all right? So, hopefully that being out of the way, let's see what we can expect to discuss tonight. I broke it up into two very simple sections, but the first section is a massively complex one. And the first one is that we're going to define and understand, or at least seek to define and understand, what are the common behavioral narcissistic traits that make up this experience with people that we consider to be narcissists. And once we've done that, and that is a massive thing on its own, right? And I'll tell you in a second why it is that I'm choosing this approach. Once we've done that, we're going to focus on how does that potentially impact the person that's experiencing the behavior or that's on the receiving end of the behavior, and what they need to do in their own space to be able to recover from the impact of it and move on. But because of how much is going to come out of the discussion relating to understanding those behaviors and what drives it, I don't expect us to have too much discussion afterwards about how it is that you need to recover from it, because innately you'll start recognizing that if that is really the underlying trigger for their behavior, then it changes the way you assume the drivers and the influences are behind what they're doing. So it no longer becomes something about whether it was you that caused it or you that deserved it, but it's more about understanding where it comes from. And I don't want to preempt too much. So basically those are the two sections: understanding the behavior and the persona around that behavior and how it shapes, and then understanding how it is that we can achieve a more enlightened state about it so that we can emerge from the space that is created as a result of interacting with someone like that. So if we look at the official dictionary meaning of narcissism, not the narcissist or narcissistic behavior, narcissism itself. Narcissism itself is defined as an excessive interest in or admiration of oneself and one's physical appearance. Now, if if you listen to that, it suggests that we all, at some point or another, might have some narcissistic tendencies. But there's always moderation. If it's applied in moderation, it reflects a matter of self-worth and pride in your appearance and appreciation for who you are. If you do it excessively, it becomes toxic, it becomes destructive, it becomes damaging to people around you and to yourself, right? So, to repeat that, the definition, the dictionary definition of narcissism is to have an excessive interest in and admiration of oneself, so you as a person, or your physical appearance, how you appear to others. So the official definition of narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder is a mental condition. I'm reading this now verbatim from, and I got this from the Mayo Clinic site, just so that you know what my point of reference is a mental condition in which people have an inflated sense of their own importance, a deep need for excessive attention and admiration, the emphasis there being on the deep need for excessive attention and admiration, troubled relationships, and a lack of empathy for others. But, they go on to say, but behind this mask of extreme confidence, lies a fragile self-esteem that's vulnerable to the slightest criticism. Now, I can imagine that a number of you are nodding your heads and saying, yeah, that's what they're about, right? And, okay, that's what they're about. Let's understand why they are about that. So what I decided to do was take key points from there and break it down. And the first one that came out from that for me was that inflated sense of importance. And there's a couple of things that grabbed me from that. And the first thing is that why would it need to be inflated? The only time you inflate something or exaggerate something is if its original state, its natural state, is considered to be insufficient. But insufficient for what? You wouldn't have a need to exaggerate something unless you were trying to get a certain response from others. And the only reason you would exaggerate it is because if you believed that the default state of it is not impressive enough. So this inflated sense of importance is a need to appear to be more than you are. So why would you need to appear to be more than you are? You have to start off with the belief that who you are is inadequate, is insufficient. Because if you had a belief that you were sufficient, that you were enough, that you were adequate, that you are significant, that you have something of value to offer, you wouldn't have to embellish it in any way to make it more appealing to someone else. So the inflated sense of importance that defines part of the default or the most common characteristics or traits of a narcissist, one of those default traits or the most common traits is that inflated sense of importance, and that inflated sense of importance means that they start off on the belief that they are not worthy, that they are not enough. So they have to escalate, they have to exaggerate, they have to inflate it so that they can appear more appealing to others. All right, that's the first point. Why do they need to appear important? Because it's in that appearance of importance that they will get the kind of response that they're looking for. So again, it's an investment in being seen a certain way, because we already start off believing that if people see us for who we are, they're not going to take us seriously. They're not going to appreciate us. They're not going to value us. They might not even have any time for us. They might just discard us. So to avoid being discarded and being undermined or being ridiculed, we make ourselves appear to be more important than we are. All right? And that sets the tone for what's to come. So what was the second thing that came out from that official definition from the DSM guideline? A need for attention and admiration. Why attention and admiration? Because attention and admiration suggests that whoever is looking at them, whoever is observing them or interacting with them, that if they pay attention and they admire, then automatically it implies that what they see is impressive. And if it's impressive, remember the inflated sense of self, the inflated sense of importance? It means that they're now achieving that goal. So the need for attention and admiration, they have to constantly distract attention away from anything that might expose them to be inadequate, insignificant, incompetent. And as a result, you'll find that this drives a lot of defensive behavior. But I'm not going to get into the behavior responses now because that's coming up later. But the need for attention and the need for admiration is to pacify that vulnerability, that fear that they have in themselves about not being enough. So automatically they're driven towards attention-seeking behavior. And that attention-seeking behavior is not always positive. In fact, more often than not, it's negative. Because the attention-seeking behavior is just to get people to sympathize with them, or to admire them, or to celebrate them, right? But it's a range. It's not always positive outcomes. Sometimes it's because they want someone to look at them and think, oh my God, you've got so much to deal with. Oh my God, your struggle is so intense. I wouldn't be able to deal with it if I were you. And that's the kind of sympathy and admiration, toxic admiration, that they look for, because it reaffirms their belief that, yes, my condition is so serious and so grave and so heavy and so burdensome that no one else will be able to deal with it. So you need to understand how bad I've got it before you'll be able to appreciate why I behave the way I do. And that's part of the attention-seeking behavior that they try to achieve, all right? Troubled relationships was one of the other things that was pointed out. Now, troubled relationships is almost a natural consequence of this kind of behavior, because this kind of behavior, if you start off feeling inadequate, your entire focus is going to be on being more adequate, being more significant, being more competent, right? Trying to prove your worth and prove your value. And all that means is that you're constantly focused on yourself and not on the other person in the relationship. You're constantly focused on what you need to do to secure your role in that relationship, rather than focusing on what the other person needs from the relationship. And as a result, everything becomes centered around your needs, because your needs are the only thing that gives you a sense of importance, or a sense of value, or a sense of relevance in that relationship. So as long as those needs of yours are being served, it means that the other person appreciates you in some way, or at least sees you, recognizes you, appreciates what it is that you need. So the moment you are self-centered or self-obsessed in the way you present yourself into a relationship, it's inevitable that it will be a troubled relationship. And if it's not a troubled relationship, then you've got even bigger problems, because then it's just encouraging and nurturing that same unhealthy behavior. The lack of empathy. This was an interesting one. And how they described this. So what I did also was I went beyond the DSM definition and went into a list of traits that was described by Mayo Clinic on their site. And you can see it. I'll try and post the link onto the group later on. But in the Mayo Clinic website, where they discuss it's almost like a fact sheet of narcissism, they have a list of traits that you would then experience with narcissists. And lack of empathy was one of the ones that resonated most strongly with the official definition. So their description of a lack of empathy is they have an inability or unwillingness to recognize the needs and feelings of others. An inability or unwillingness, right? And those are two critical points. It's not about recognizing the needs and feelings of others, it's about the inability and the unwillingness. So the inability is grounded in the fact that you cannot give what you don't have. If you've never experienced empathy or sympathy or compassion or affection, you would be emotionally incompetent to be able to express it healthily in a relationship, right? So that will be the inability part of it, which will appear as a lack of empathy. The unwillingness is if you are insecure about your ability to be able to express it because of your tarnished or tainted sense of self, where you believe you're not enough. Remember, we started out saying an inflated sense of importance, because we already believe that who we are is falling short of what other people respect or admire, right? So the unwillingness is that we see that if we're going to try to express ourselves and we're not enough, and we try to put someone else's needs first, by showing empathy. And the moment we do that, it's going to automatically diminish our needs. And that's the threat that we're responding to. We don't want to diminish our standing in that relationship. So the moment we're going to recognize that someone else has a more legitimate or a more important need than what we have, it automatically assumes or suggests that our needs are not as important as theirs. So to protect ourselves from being irrelevant, from becoming insignificant, we then automatically show a insensitivity or a disinterest towards what their needs are. Because identifying their needs demands two things. One, it has to recognize how their needs compare to what our needs are. And secondly, it means that the moment I acknowledge that that need is there, that means that I am now obliged to do something about it, especially if it's in a trust relationship, right? So if it's in a trust relationship and I become aware of the fact that you need something from me, the moment you know I'm aware of the fact that you need that from me, it means that there's an expectation now that as part of that trust that we share, that I need to do something towards fulfilling that need that you have from me. But if I'm insecure about my ability to fulfill that need, I'm not going to admit that, because my whole underlying driver is for me not to admit vulnerability or weakness or incompetence, right? So what do I need to do then to respond to it? I need to either diminish it and make it seem that it's not as important as you think it is, because there's other more important things that we need to worry about, or I need to pretend it doesn't exist. Because if I don't acknowledge it, it means that I've got no obligation to respond to it, because then I've got a defense that I can plead, right? So to protect myself from appearing emotionally incompetent in that space, I just avoid any setting or any scenario that demands that I must make myself emotionally available. And that's how I protect myself from appearing vulnerable or weak. All right, the next one is the fragile self-esteem. Remember, it said that underlying all of this, there's a fragile self-esteem. And this is the part that kind of nails it for me, right? And there's a lot more that nails it, so I'm going to probably say that a couple of times. But the reason why this nails it for me is that if someone is believed to be truly narcissistic by choice, right, then that means that they will be convinced about their importance, about their significance, about their grandeur, right? Because grandiose behavior is one of the key traits of narcissistic behavior, right? So if that is true, if we believe that they are convinced that they are all that and more and so important and so everything, right? If we honestly believe that they are convinced that that is true about themselves, why would there be an underlying fragile self-esteem? Because if you're convinced about yourself, nothing can shake your self-esteem, because you're connected with the value of why it is that you are who you are. But if you're not connected with that value, if you doubt it, if you doubt your significance, if you doubt your value, if you doubt your self-worth, if you doubt your worth in the relationship, your self-esteem is going to be on a knife edge all the time, because you started out by not wanting to appear weak, because you see that appearance of weakness as being something that will diminish your significance in the relationship. So if you start out by protecting yourself from appearing weak, what you're doing now with a fragile self-esteem is you have to protect it, you have to hide it, right? So if that self-esteem is fragile, it again gives us reason to question whether what we assume to be deliberate and conviction behind the toxic behavior, we need to question whether that is really something that is done from a position of confidence and insensitivity, or is it done from a position of fear? Because so far the one consistent thread through all of this is that it is fear of being discovered to be inadequate that drives the behavior more than anything else. And we'll see that coming up more and more in some of the other traits, all right? Yes, it can. And the origins of it are varied. But it also happens sometimes where they are raised in a very wholesome environment, but a disastrous relationship causes them to question their value and their self-worth. And if they grow bitter enough about how they were treated, they can then quite easily move to the space of saying, well, If no one's going to take care of me, I'm going to take care of myself, and then they become the center of their own world to protect themselves from being taken advantage of ever again. So yes, sometimes it is from a childhood, or from caregivers, or from a dysfunctional home environment, or whatever it is. But it's not always that. But more importantly, the moment we reach that age of self-awareness, we then have the ability to question whether or not the way we treated is a definition of who we are, or is it a definition of the people that treated us that way. Entitlement is the belief that we are owed something. It's a belief that we deserve something. Whether we earned it or not is irrelevant. If we feel entitled to it purely because of the fact that we exist, or because we exist in a specific setting or in a relationship, then that entitlement means that we have an unspoken contract with the person that we're with or interacting with. And that entitlement then becomes the source of any potential betrayal of trust. So if we don't get what we believe we're entitled to, we feel as if we're being undermined or shortchanged or cheated out of something that is rightfully ours. And as a result, we then put in extra effort to either claim it or to make sure that someone knows exactly how unhappy we are about the fact that what we're entitled to, we're not getting. All right, so that's where the entitlement comes in. Entitlement is very, very strongly associated with expectation. The more our expectations are untempered, are not tested for relevance, then those expectations eventually become a sense of entitlement. And if we're not aware of the fact that it's an expectation and not necessarily a right that we have, then automatically we expect that expectation to be fulfilled. Remember in the depression discussion we talked about expectations as well? And a saturation of failed expectations leads to an abandonment of hope. And the abandonment of hope is what leads to depression. Now, the same thing happens with shame. If the expectation is that that we believe we're supposed to operate at a certain level, but to operate at that level, we need something in return. If that is our expectation, but we consistently find that those around us that's supposed to make us feel significant in that moment don't do that for us, we feel that as a failed expectation, which is a betrayal of trust, and that betrayal of trust then makes us feel ashamed about the fact that once again we're inadequate, we're insignificant, and then we try to protect that shame by becoming aggressive. Recognition without achievement. This is another common one. They expect to be celebrated for the fact that they show up. That just because they put in minimal effort, we must respect the struggle that they go through just to do that little bit, because it's not that little bit that is so important, it's the fact that they had to overcome all of these obstacles and hurdles before they were able to do even that small bit. And they expect to be recognized and admired and revered and appreciated overtly and excessively for the fact that, oh wow, despite everything you're dealing with, you're still able to at least do this bit for us. That is one of the narcissistic traits, because they're so focused on their struggle that they don't recognize the struggles of others. That's the lack of empathy that comes in. And because they don't recognize the struggles of others, they automatically assume that their struggle is the worst struggle around. So anything that they do from that position of being intensely challenged and persecuted, anything that they do for the benefit of anyone else must be completely and totally, unquestionably appreciated and celebrated, because they must understand how much they had to go through just to do that little bit. They are preoccupied with fantasies about success, power, brilliance, genius syndrome, beauty, or having the perfect mate. So everything around them becomes a trophy. Everything around them becomes a token of their success. They need to uphold that appearance, right? And if you need to uphold that appearance, it means you're preoccupied with how others perceive you rather than who you are and what you are worth to yourself and what you contribute. So this preoccupation with the appearance of success is purely because they have this deeply ingrained sense of inadequacy. And if you feel you're inadequate, if you believe you're inadequate, you're going to distract people from that inadequacy by associating yourself with tokens of success. And some of the tokens of success is what they mentioned, right? Beauty. Everyone appreciates and recognizes beauty. Brilliance. You must appear to be like the biggest and most inspirational thinker in the room, right? No one else can be better than you. You must have the perfect mate. You must have this perfect life so that everyone can say how accomplished you are and how it is that you just really know how to keep it all together, right? That's part of all of that sense of grandeur, or this appearance of grandeur. They believe they're superior. Again, this is what we perceive in them. They believe they are superior and can only associate with equally special people. Power of association. If I associate myself with professors and academics and professionals, it means that by inclusion in those circles, I must be as respectable or as accomplished as they are. So, it means that anyone that is perceived to be less than what I want to be associated with, I have to distance myself from them. And the way I distance myself from them is I make them aware of the fact that they're not good enough to hang out with me. They're not good enough to be associated with me. Because my self-esteem is grounded in who and what I'm associated with. The trophies, the trinkets, that defines my self-esteem. Or at least that is my statement to the world about what I think of myself. The fact that I'm ashamed of who I am, no one must know that. So we distract people from realizing exactly how much shame we carry within us by pretending to have a perfect life, by pretending to have a good career, being successful in business, all of these things. What happens behind the scenes, no one must know. And if there's a threat of anyone discovering what's happening behind the scenes to uphold these appearances, then you'll see the complete raging madness come out, because that is the greatest vulnerability that they want to protect themselves from. The vulnerability of being discovered to be inadequate. Monopolize conversations. I touched on this just now. The reason why there's a need to monopolize in conversations, well, let's just look at the definition. They're saying that the trait is that they monopolize conversations and belittle or look down on people they perceive as inferior. I just touched on it just now. But why? Why would they need to do this? Because the appearance of superiority is dependent on being surrounded by people that are inferior. So the moment you're in a room where someone else appears to be more competent, more knowledgeable, more well-read than you, having a more informed opinion than you, automatically you need to poke holes or attack them in ways that distracts from their competence so that your incompetence doesn't become visible. So again, when they monopolize conversations, it's not because they don't care about what someone else says. It's that they do care about what someone else says, and they care enough to know that if someone else has a more informed opinion than them, they're going to look stupid. So they don't want to allow themselves to be exposed to that threat. And the way you avoid being exposed to that threat is you prevent them from being heard. You prevent them from appearing competent. Because by preventing someone from appearing competent, you automatically appear more competent than them. That's the belief anyway. The next trait identified as being a common trait of narcissistic behavior is that they expect special treatment. So the rules don't apply to them. And the reason the rules don't apply to them is because they expect, according to the definition now, they expect special favors and unquestioning compliance with their expectations. Now, why expecting special favors and unquestioning compliance? The special favors is because someone needs to recognize that they've got it so bad that they need to get special treatment, right? Everyone else has got it easy. I've got it bad. And because I've got it bad and I've got so much responsibility and I'm trying so hard and I'm doing so much for so many people, you need to cut me some slack. Because it's not my fault that I can't meet expectations. It's because all the odds are stacked against me. So give me special treatment. Unquestioning compliance with expectations. Unquestioning part is the important part. Because the moment someone questions the validity of their claim that they've got it so hard, or this is why they need special treatment, the moment someone questions it, it's immediately a threat to their self-esteem. It's a threat to their standing in that moment. It's a threat that's going to expose the fact that they are pretentious and they are fake in what they're presenting, and that shame that they've been trying to hide, that shame is then at risk of surfacing. And someone's going to see the vulnerability, see the weakness, see the inadequacy that's going to come to the fore the moment they are challenged about their claim to justify special treatment for them. So the moment they don't get what they want and the rules have to apply to them, they're at a disadvantage, right? They're at a disadvantage because they already recognize that everyone else that plays by the rules are already more competent than they are to be able to operate within those parameters. And the moment they convince themselves that everyone else appears to be more competent than they are within that rule set, they have to demand special attention so that they can compensate for their inadequacy to be able to operate in the same space. And that's why they demand a special treatment. It's to protect themselves from being measured against the same standard as everyone else, because the moment that playing field is leveled, they are convinced that they will come up short. And that again will expose their weakness and their inadequacy. They manipulate others. They take advantage of others to get what they want. This is one of the most damaging traits, because no one wants to be used. The important thing to remember here is that we only manipulate others when we believe that ethics and values are only relevant if it satisfies what it is that we need to get out of that moment. That's critical. Because ethics and values are the things that form the core of our social contracts. We assume that in establishing a trust relationship or a trust contract with someone, the assumption is that both parties honor the same values, the same standard, the same morality, the same ethics that will allow that trust relationship to be effective and to be healthy. Right? So when they manipulate, they have to discard that, because again, they can't afford to play on a level playing field, right? So the person that plays by the rules, that upholds the trust, that respects the values and the ethics, because that defines their worth. The moment they come up against someone that's got these narcissistic tendencies, that doesn't respect those ethics and values, because they deserve special treatment, right? This is what they believe. So the moment you come up with against someone like that, immediately you're assuming that they honor what you honor. And when you do that, and they know that you do that, you become easy to manipulate, because all they have to do then is provoke you about the values that you are going to compromise by not giving them what they want, so that you can stay true to your value system while they get what they want. And that's how they manipulate you. And again, the reason they manipulate is because it inflates that sense of self. It inflates that self-importance. Because if they can get people to do their bidding for them, if they can get people to meet their every need, or to sacrifice what they need so that the narcissistic person can get what they need, the moment someone else sacrifices to satisfy the need of the narcissist, immediately it elevates the stature of the narcissist in their own mind. Why? Because all their efforts to inflate that sense of self-importance, to compensate for their inadequacy, to hide their shame, all of that is satisfied. Because they were successful at making sure that someone else put their needs ahead of their own. And that's why they manipulate. So they manipulate because they also need to fill that void. Because if they manipulate, it means that they have some significance, they have some authority, they have some influence. And that all feeds that void of, I'm only good enough if I can get something out of it. If I am the priority, if I am the one being served, if I am the one that is being considered as the most important thing in that moment. Not entirely. The empathy is a threat to them. Remember, they don't have the emotional makeup to be able to empathize. And because they don't have the emotional makeup to empathize, the manipulation becomes a tool to protect themselves from it. It's not because they lack empathy, it's because they are threatened by empathy. But manipulation feeds that sense of self. So it's a fine line, but it's important to separate the two, because if you're going to combine the two of manipulation and empathy being one feeding the other, then automatically you're going to lose sight of when the lack of empathy plays out, even though there's no manipulation present, and vice versa. Because sometimes they can manipulate you by appearing to be compassionate and understanding and considerate, right? Because they have a bigger goal in mind. So if they give you a little bit of what you need, they know that you're going to be more giving in return. So then when they need something from you to achieve something else that is bigger than what it is that you need from them, they'll give in to that just so that they can soften you up so that you can do what it is that they need from you. And that's how the manipulation happens without the empathy. Or that's how they display some empathy to manipulate. So it's two very different ways in which they seek to get an outcome, all right? So remember on the envy part, envy drives them. And the trait is that they are envious of others and believe that others are envious of them. And envy is a focus on what you don't have, right? Comparing yourself to those that have more than you and not considering how much more you've got than those that have less than you. That's envy, right? It reinforces or it re-emphasizes the fact that they thrive on comparing, because the only way they know where they stand is if they compare themselves to what's happening around them and to others. Because they don't have a sense of self, automatically the only way they know whether they will appear successful to others is if they compare how they stand compared to others that they see are being respected as successful. So for example, if you're sitting in a group and one person in the group is obviously respected and admired by the other members of that group, that becomes the benchmark. So then they must compare themselves to that person, and if they believe that they can stand toe to toe with that person, then no problem. They'll go toe to toe because they're confident they'll be able to maintain their stature in that group. The moment they believe that that person is going to steal the limelight from them, which is going to make them feel inadequate, and then that inadequacy is going to show up and they're going to feel ashamed about the fact that they're not enough, that's when they'll start attacking and distracting from the merit of the person that is a threat to them. So remember that if they thrive on comparing, it means that they're always going to focus on who has more and not what they have. So anything that they have is always not enough, because they're going to look at who's got more than them, and they're constantly striving to make sure that they are at that level, because if they settle for less than what someone else has that's in their social circle, it means that they are automatically going to be at risk of not being seen as good enough. So they're going to be considered a failure, or they're going to consider themselves a failure because they can't match up to what is perceived to be successful. They behave deliberately arrogant. They behave in an arrogant or haughty manner, coming across as conceited, boastful, and pretentious. Arrogance is an interesting one, because arrogance automatically assumes that you don't care about anyone else, right? But there's a more deeper underlying truth to why people behave arrogantly. People that behave arrogantly behave that way because they've given up hope that anyone else is going to take care of what it is that they need. It's really that simple. The moment I have no reason to believe someone else is going to nurture me, care for me, or consider what I need, I'm going to take it. I'm going to make sure that whatever I need, I'm going to put in the effort to make sure that I get it. And the reason I need to do that is because I have no trust on anyone else. And the reason I won't have any trust on anyone else, remember one of the narcissistic traits or the effects of being a narcissist is that you have troubled relationships. So your trust relationships are always going to be shaky. And if the trust is shaky, it means that you can't rely on people to do what it is that you need. The other reason you can't rely on people to do what you need is because you'd never ever tell them what you need, because you think that being needy is a weakness. So it's a catch-22. And as a result of that, behaving arrogantly is a natural defense for it. Because behaving arrogantly in a haughty manner, coming across as conceited, boastful, pretentious, all of that distracts from the neediness and makes it seem as if you're just so confident and so bold that no one's going to get in your way. It's not that. You'll only allow people to do things for you if you don't see that contribution as a weakness on your part. And the moment you see it as a weakness on your part, you'll try to appear to be aloof, to be above it, so that you're not dependent on others. They must have the best. This is again not talking about the trophies and things, right? They must have the best. They insist on having the best of everything. For instance, the best car or office or job or title or exclusivity. And the exclusivity part is an interesting one. Because remember, they're comparing, right? If they're comparing, then that means they are measuring their success based on what other people have. Now, if they get into a state where what other people have is something that is physically and technically out of reach for them, because they don't have the resources, they don't have the means, they don't have the capability, whatever it is, to acquire what it is that someone else has, what they will do is they will try to find something that is potentially the equivalent of it, but not as prestigious, but make it more prestigious by claiming exclusivity, one of a kind. No one else has this. I went through so much trouble to get this because it's so rare, right? So now they have to elevate the status of what they have so that it appears to be as good or as important or as successful as what someone else has. And that's how they always ensure that in their mind they've got the best. And they need that because if they don't have the best, it means that they are falling short. And they don't want to fall short. Their typical responses are they get angry easily, right? This is an obvious one. They are easily riled up, they are easily incensed, they are easily provoked. And the reason for that is because anger is a defense mechanism. Anyone that gets angry, or if anyone here that's listening now, if you get angry, understand that you get angry because you feel threatened, you feel attacked. Because anger is a defense mechanism and you wouldn't have something to defend if you didn't believe it was attacked. But, more importantly, you wouldn't want to defend something if you didn't believe it was vulnerable. I'll say that again. Anger is a defense mechanism, and you wouldn't defend something if you didn't think it was being attacked, and you wouldn't be concerned about it being attacked if you didn't believe it was a vulnerability in the first place. That's how it plays out. So the moment they become impatient or angry when they don't receive that special treatment or something, or when they don't have that compliance that they need, then they get angry because it's a threat. It's an attack on their significance. And they're putting in so much of effort and so much investment in making sure that they appear significant and successful, that the moment that effort is at risk of not being enough, they feel threatened and they come out, guns blazing again, with anger, right? So anger is a defense mechanism. Always remember that. If you want to get your anger under control, the moment you feel the anger rising, ask yourself a very simple question. What is being attacked? And then you test it for relevance. You test it for validity. Is it really being attacked? And if it is being attacked, is it a legitimate attack or isn't it a legitimate attack? But that's another discussion all on its own. They have interpersonal problems. The interpersonal problems are inevitable because they are so self-centered, so self-obsessed with their weakness, with their vulnerability, with how they need to protect themselves, that they lose complete sight of anything that's happening around them or anything that anyone needs that's around them. They are extra sensitive. They don't like being dismissed or disagreed with because they are sensitive for the reason that they are consistently under a threat state. So if you're constantly under a threat state, your focus is on where's the next risk coming from? What is the next thing that's going to potentially unseat you? What's the next thing that's going to expose you? And because of that, they're extremely sensitive to the slightest thing that appears to be a threat to who they want to present themselves as. And that's why they're extra sensitive. And to protect themselves, because they lack that emotional skill set, that emotional breadth and depth, the only thing they can do is they can demand significance through anger and aggression. They like to belittle others. And this is a common thing that they do, right? And they belittle others, like I said earlier, because as long as everyone else appears to be inferior, it makes them by default superior. And that again feeds into that unhealthy self-esteem. Okay, and they're easily triggered. And I think this was covered in the sensitivity part. They're easily triggered because they'll appear to be struggling to regulate their emotional responses, right? And then we assume that that is because there's some other underlying factors and everything. It's not. The reason they find it difficult to regulate their emotions is because they're constantly looking for threats. They're constantly looking for what it is that's going to make them appear incompetent or inadequate or insignificant. And because of that, They appear to be unstable emotionally, but they're not unstable. They're just consistently on threat alert of the highest level. So when you're on edge all the time because you feel vulnerable all the time, everything appears to be a threat to you. Unless you are the center of attention, unless you are recognized as the best, unless you are recognized as successful, unless people connect with your struggle and they sympathize with all the things that you are dealing with in that, unless you are always admired and revered and respected and are getting the attention that you need, the moment that stops, you feel threatened, and when you feel threatened, anger. And they hate change. And the reason they hate change is because change means that they have to now develop a new skill set to be able to maintain that facade that they've been maintaining in a familiar environment. So change threatens them because it threatens again to reveal their incompetence, their lack of being able to keep up. All right? Okay, and as a result of all of that, they often appear moody and depressed. They always have clouds hanging over them. And the reason they have clouds hanging over them all the time is because they constantly feel persecuted. And because they feel persecuted, they need to compensate for it. And because they need to compensate for it and they don't know how to, that's how all the other toxic traits and all the other damaging traits and destructive traits of theirs come to the fore, because that allows them to compensate for it without having the emotional tools to do it in a healthier way. And they secretly feel ashamed. They secretly feel ashamed because that is exactly what they're hiding. They're hiding the fact that they have this intense belief that they are not good enough. And where that came from, more often than not, it came long before any relationship you entered into with them. But when they entered into the relationship, they assumed that the relationship was going to satisfy that void. And the moment they realized that it wasn't going to be about them only, it was going to be about them also contributing towards someone else, and the moment they had reason to believe that they were inadequate or they weren't going to be able to live up to that expectation, the narcissistic traits as a defense mechanism kicks in. That's why they appear to always be aggressive, because they're protecting themselves. They always appear to be defensive. They're protecting themselves. They're protecting what it is that they don't want someone to discover is lacking in them. One of the most common things is, why didn't you see the signs, right? When you finally realize that this is the kind of character that you're dealing with or that you've been exposed to all this time, the first thing is, why didn't you notice it? Why didn't you realize it sooner before you lost yourself to it? And here's one of the reasons why. One of the reasons why is because you were so invested in your belief in the goodness that they have within them that you didn't want to betray that belief, because it felt like a betrayal of the trust that you believe existed between the two of you. So that's one of the most common reasons why we don't see people for who they are, because we see the potential in them and we're so convinced about them being able to achieve that potential that we are willing to sacrifice what we need just so that we can uplift them. You assumed that they were as committed to the relationship as you were. They were committed to the relationship, but they were looking to get something very different from what you were trying to get from the relationship. While you were trying to get companionship, or whatever it is that you were trying to get from it, they were trying to get compensation for the inadequacy. They were trying to get someone to make them feel better about themselves. And you thought that you were getting into a relationship with someone that was going to make you feel good so that you in turn could make them feel good, and that's how the healthy balance would come about, right? They were committed to the relationship, but for different reasons. And that difference in reasons, the moment you recognize what they're trying to get out of the relationship versus what you were expecting them to want from the relationship, the moment you recognize the difference, you can then, it's one step closer to seeing them for who they are versus who you thought they are. You grew to believe their belittling of you. So when they diminished your accomplishments, when they diminished your stature, your contribution, your needs, your struggle, your sacrifices, when they diminished it, The reason they did that was because they needed to make sure that you were not going to be perceived, or you had no reason to believe that you were better than them. Because remember, they're consistently trying to make sure that no one discovers how inadequate they are. So by doing that, they have to make everyone else either appear to be on their level or lower than them. So that's why they will belittle others. And if your sense of self is not strong enough, or because you're more invested in them and your relationship than what you are invested in yourself, you will lose yourself to that belittling, and you'll eventually become convinced that the reason why you are in that relationship and it's having the problems that it is because you are not good enough to be able to get them to be better. But it's because they need company in their state of feeling inadequate. So that's why people destroy others. They destroy others because they need that damaged person to be as damaged as they are, so that together they can say, yeah, it's a tough world. And you see, I wasn't so bad all along. How do you move on from that state? Firstly, you need to reconcile who you thought they were with who they proved to be. And this is a difficult one. It's a difficult one because it means that you have to accept that the shared values and the shared dreams and hopes and aspirations and goals that you thought you had with them, that you invested so much with them, you have to accept that they weren't as invested as you were. And in doing so, you might believe that that makes you gullible, foolish, ignorant, any number of things. But it's not about judging yourself, it's about understanding. You need to understand that you were looking for something that was wholesome and good and beneficial to what you thought was the outcomes that you were both striving for, but they weren't. And the moment you recognize that difference, it makes it easier for you to see them for who they are rather than who you thought they were. And gullibility is not a bad thing, especially if you're doing it willingly because you trust. You won't trust someone else if you are not trustworthy. You can't give what you don't have. Test your assumptions about yourself. Remember all that belittling that happened over that extended period of time? All that belittling, all of that condescension, all of that criticism, all of that diminishing, it will change in some ways how it is that you see yourself, what you believe to be true about yourself. So what you need to do now to be able to move on, you need to test all of those assumptions you made about yourself. Are you really that incompetent? Are you really that insignificant? Were you really that incapable of influencing them? Were you really not up to the task of providing for what their needs were? All of those things, those assumptions you made about what it was your shortcomings. You need to test whether those shortcomings were real or not. And if you find that any of them are real, for whatever reason, understand why it couldn't have been different. Because the environment, the relationship, the circumstances didn't nurture you. It broke you down. Remember that. If the environment and everything else around you was engineered to break you down, how can you expect yourself to thrive in that space? The environment has to be nurturing towards your intended outcomes, your intended goals. And if you're going to consistently expose yourself to an environment that fights against everything you hold true, everything that you cherish, everything that you revere and honor and respect, if you're constantly in that environment, it will feel as if you are insane for holding on to those ideals. It's like Kurt Vonnegut said, I think I've quoted him before. If you compare a sane person to an insane society, they will appear insane. And the same thing applies here. If you compare a sane person to an insane person, and you assume that the insane person is the standard that you must judge yourself by, the sane person will appear insane. Recognize that the potential you see in them, this is an important one for moving on. You need to recognize that the potential that you see in them, remember, it's your belief in their goodness. Remember that your belief in them is completely useless if they don't agree with you. You can believe that someone is capable of conquering the world, and you can have absolutely good reason and motivation to believe that that is true and completely possible. But if they don't believe it, they won't do anything towards achieving it. And no matter how much you believe in them, they're just going to consistently work against your belief in them to prove to you that you're wrong. And sometimes when you believe in someone and you believe that they are capable of more than they're doing right now, they see that as a threat. And they see it as a threat because, again, they're afraid of appearing incompetent. So rather than appear incompetent, they will rather protect themselves from exposing themselves to this potential failure. And as a result, they'll fight you on it. You're trying to do what's best for them, but they'll fight you on it, and you won't understand why it is that they are fighting you on something that you believe is going to benefit them. So you need to recognize that the potential that you see in them is completely useless if they don't believe that they have that potential themselves. What have we got left? Check your value system compared to theirs. Biggest mistake that causes relationships to fail is the assumption that you share the value system of your partner. Your value system is not your belief system. It's not your religion. It's not your culture. Your value system is what you prioritize from that common frame of reference. So, I'm going to say that again. Your value system is unique to you. Your frame of reference might be common. You both might be of the same religious persuasion. You both might be of the same cultural background. Might be the same ethnicity, whatever it is. That's just the frame of reference. It's the same reason why you can have two people operating in the same system, and one will be ethically corrupt and the other one will be ethically grounded. What you place emphasis on, what you prioritize or subscribe to in that frame of reference, that's what determines your value system. And if your partner is not subscribing to the same things as being important from that frame of reference, you don't have the same value system. And if you don't recognize those differences, you'll assume that you're talking to someone that understands and agrees with what you see as being important. Meanwhile, you're constantly at opposite ends of that argument. And that's how you can lose your sanity, by wondering why it is that you just can't get through to them. Because you're making the assumption that the basis on which you are positioning your view is the same basis on which they respect that view to be positioned. Giving up on your hopes and dreams with them is not failure, it's courage. This is an important one. This is a big one. Because more often than not, we don't want to feel like we've wasted our life by having invested so much for so long, only to amount to relatively nothing. The sooner you make peace with the fact that the investment in those hopes and dreams was a one-sided investment, and it was an investment that was doomed to failure if there wasn't a mutual investment in it. The moment you recognize that, you'll recognize that the reason you have to give up on it is not because you failed. It's because they were unwilling to commit. And if you've got hopes and dreams and aspirations that is intended to benefit two parties, and both parties have to be invested in it. Otherwise, it's not a joint dream that you're building. And then you're effectively trying to build a dream for yourself with someone that doesn't value your dream. And giving up on that is courage, not because it's a nice thing to say. No. Giving up on that is courage because it means that you have to accept that it was potentially a wasted investment, but you're freeing up yourself to be able to invest in something more meaningful and more realistic by letting go of what it is that was holding you back. Recognize your worth and strength for holding it together against the insanity. How many of you are willing to give yourselves credit for the fact that no matter how much you might have been impacted or worn down in the process, that despite all of that, you still had enough sense to recognize that it was something that was unhealthy for you? How many of you are willing to give yourself that credit? Because if you're not willing to give yourself that credit, then that means you are still seeing yourself through their eyes. That's an inner one. Think about that. If you are not willing to be kind to yourself, you are still viewing yourself through the lens that they created in your relationship with you. And if you're doing that, then you're carrying their burdens, not your own. You're giving credibility to someone who has already proven that they did not deserve that credibility. Because if they deserved it, you wouldn't be in a position of questioning whether or not you were in a relationship with a narcissist or with someone with narcissistic tendencies. So, recognize your worth and your strength for holding it together against the insanity that you were surrounded with. And the moment you recognize that, you'll be able to build on it. If you continue to denounce it, if you continue to dismiss it or ignore it or reject it, and you believe that it was of no use, so what's the point in recognizing it? You won't be able to build on something that you don't honor, that you don't respect. You can only build on something if you see the value in it. So if you don't see your value in being able to cope with that very difficult environment and circumstance, if you don't see the value that is inherent within you that allowed you to be able to operate and function still with some reason in that space, you won't be able to give yourself credit for it and lift yourself out of it. And then one final section that I wanted to touch on quickly. What if children are involved? Who protects the children from the influences of that narcissistic behavior? Children are impressionable, yes, but they are also resilient. Children learn with their eyes and their ears, and they practice with their hands and their mouths, right? We all agree on that. So what you need to do is make sure that you are consistent and true to what you want your children to adopt as their value system. Any advice for kids who have a narcissistic parent? The one thing you want to do, Zakia, for that is you don't want to actively influence them against the other parent. The moment you actively influence them against the other parent, you become the demon. You become the one that fits the description that the other parent will potentially want to influence them about. So if you're trying to protect them against the influence of the narcissistic one, you need to give them a base of experience that counters what it is that you don't want them to adopt. They need to experience the value of a value system that is better than the one that they are being exposed to when they go to the other parent or when they're exposed to the other parent. So you need to insulate them from that influence. And the way you insulate them from that influence is not by keeping them away from it, because the moment you keep them away from it, or the moment you try to protect them from it too much, you also prevent them from learning how to cope with it, how to deal with it, how to respond to it. So in order to get them to understand how they need to respond to those things and how they need to deal with it and how they need to understand it doesn't define who they are and their sense of self, the only way you can do that is to give them a grounding and understanding and a value system experience that connects them with something that is more valuable than what they're going to experience there. And materialism doesn't sway kids. It's a distraction for them, but it doesn't sway them. You need to connect meaningfully with the kids. You can't protect them from the reality of it. If you protect them from the reality of it, you end up being dishonest. They pick up on the dishonesty. They pick up on the lack of sincerity. And when they feel that lack of authenticity with anyone that they're dealing with, you'll see kids will always, always withdraw from people that are not authentic. Test that out and you'll see what I'm saying. So focus on being consistent in your value system so that they can experience the value of your value system. And in them experiencing it and connecting with it, that's the only way they're going to want it for themselves. You can't instruct them to comply with it. You have to have a meaningful discussion with them so that they understand the why, not just what they must comply with. And the moment you're going to try and influence the children to say that that parent is bad, they're doing this and they're doing that and they destroyed you like this and they destroyed you like that. The moment you do that, all you're doing is you're creating a martyr. You're creating a martyr in the other parent that is already a negative influence for them, and you're actually giving that parent more influence over them. Because now they become curious to know whether you're just bitter or is there any truth to what it is that you're telling them about the other parent, because there's still a blood tie there. And the difficult part is that kids will always want to have a meaningful relationship with both parents, regardless of what tension and what toxicity exists between the two parents. And the only thing you can do is raise those kids with a mindset that keeps them grounded in their sense of self. Their self-esteem must be healthy. And their self-esteem is not going to be healthy if they feel caught and pulled between two parents. So you can't have the tug of war with the other parent through the kids. What you have to do is make the kids aware of why it is that whatever they might be appreciating or polarizing towards that is unhealthy for them, you need to connect them with why it's unhealthy for them. And sometimes the difficulty is that you're going to have to just be available to support them after they've experienced it. So just to finish that last point again, you need to be consistent. You need to be consistent with who you are and what you stand for. But you're not going to know that. You're not going to know what you are, what you stand for, and who you are, and what you want your children to adopt as their value system if you're constantly going to be on the defense, trying to protect yourself from the influence of the other parent. And the only way you're going to not get drawn into that defense tug of war is if you disempower it. And the way you disempower it is you see what is driving that behavior and you respond to the influence of the behavior, not to the symptom of the behavior. The moment you respond to the behavior itself, to the outcome of that underlying vulnerability, the moment you respond to that, you're responding to a defense mechanism, which means that you have to adopt the rules of the game that plays out in that defense mechanism. And if you're going against someone that's been doing that all their life, you're on the back foot. You're challenging someone that's a master at their own game. It's not going to work. You're not going to get anywhere. You're going to frustrate yourself because they have invested years and years and years of time and effort and skill in being able to be as masterful at their defense mechanisms as they are. So you don't want to challenge them on the defense mechanisms. What you want to do is you want to focus on what is the vulnerability that they are trying to protect with a defense mechanism and appeal to that vulnerability. You can either expose it, if that is the intention, or you can find a way to pacify it without compromising too much. I believe that a lot of the mental illness, mental disorder terms are excessively abused, and they are excessively abused because it gives us a comfortable space from which to be able to respond to others. The moment we look at the label, the moment we insist that the label of who we're dealing with is all that they're about, it gives us reason to ignore the fact that behind that label, behind that behavior, there's a human. And if you want to diffuse the situation, you need to recognize the human, which is recognizing the weaknesses of that person, and then your value system kicks in then. Because then you either want to pay back in kind, which means you reduce yourself to their level, or you want to pacify so that you can diffuse the situation and you can create the peace that you're looking for. It all depends on what you want to get out of it. I'm Zaid Ismail. That was a hectic discussion, at least from my side anyway. It really stretched me to be able to deal with this thing in an even-handed and understanding manner, and I hope I achieved that. So I look forward to your feedback, and I will announce soon what the next tough discussion is going to be about. Take care. I hope you have something to think about, and I hope it is of benefit to you. Assalamu alaikum.